Hello everyone, it's Niz. This is gonna be another out there format for me, as it isn't long enough to be my typical review, and it's not quite a mini review like my indie shindigs, as I want to focus pretty much exclusively on a narrative level of the game. But there are elements here that I would love to go over. There's a lot to unpack for Slay the Princess, the panoramic emotions behind the story, the lovely art, the unnervingly subtle shifting soundtrack, the wide array of skilled voice acting, while what is admittedly a small cast, having such a large range of tones and inflections they both need to put on for it to work. I will give a spoiler warning ahead of time. Everything past this point is going to be spoiling the game, to a major degree and fairly early on. The game's not particularly discreet on its subversive nature, and though there's ample mystery to the rules of it all, it rarely keeps any twist a secret for long. This is your chance to dip if you haven't heard of this game and want to give it a blind shot yourself. There'll also be blood and gore in many areas. If you're squeamish, you'll probably want to duck out of this one. With that out of the way, let's continue. Slay the Princess is a visual novel by Black Tabby Games. The premise, at least from the start, is very simple. You're on a path in the woods.
And at the end of that path is a cabin. And in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her. If you don't, it will be the end of the world.
And as you may suspect, no, things get muddled very quickly. Even if you're completely compliant the entire way, it's blatant that there's more to this. To try to make things easier to track, I'll introduce the four main characters of the story. The narrator, who will be guiding you on your quest and describing the actions and visuals of what occurs. The princess, who is the target of your pristine blade. There'll be a lot of variations of the princess with their own nicknames, which I will be using based on their designated chapter name. The protagonist, a being called the Long Quiet, who, for simplicity and to avoid confusion, I'll be referring to as Quiet when I refer to the protagonist rather than the player. The game doesn't acknowledge any separation between Quiet and the player, but the player and Quiet's perception are separate, and Quiet does take up some actions that you do not make him. Despite this, Quiet doesn't seem to have his own agency outside of pre-selected options. The fourth being the voice of the hero. You see, there are actually many voices that, like every other character involved, try to influence Quiet's decisions. Others develop later depending on your actions, but the voice of the hero is the only one you begin with and is consistent throughout each one. Voices will often give numerous and unsolicited forms of advice and argue with each other. I'll cover them if and when appropriate. To make a more complex explanation shorter, the princess is supernatural in a way. And so is Quiet. When he dies, he will come back from the start as if nothing happened, retaining memories of previous experiences. This will happen until the chapter line is concluded and you bring the vessel to her true self, where the true princess will kill Quiet and erase his memories of the experience. Every experience between Quiet and the princess ends up being very important because the princess herself is a reflection of whatever she is perceived by him. This twist will become abundantly clear after a couple of runs. It doesn't always seem to be a conscious choice, though she can do things to shift this perception. She herself doesn't have direct control over it. Neither of you do, it seems. A good example of this is whether or not you pick up the pristine blade before entering the basement is a crossroad in and of itself. If you do, she's cold, aloof, clever, and confrontational. If you don't, she's timid though friendly, and worryingly desperate. These may seem like different masks of a pathological liar, but the game was clever enough to make this distinction obvious at the stairwell, before the princess could possibly know your intent.
Her voice softly carries up the stairs.
Hello? Is someone there?
Her voice carries up the stairs.
Who's there?
She didn't change masks, it merely shifted based on your first decision in the cabin. That being whether or not you take the blade. This one act is an admission of whether Quiet believes the narrator or not on if the princess could be a threat. Even if you haven't made up your mind, this response is exclusively based on your decision here. This is what I love about Slay the Princess. There is a constant air of horror and tension, along with some dark humor, all wrapped up in an existential bow of a being that is the ebbs and flows of your action via this princess, along with this loneliness of knowledge none can maintain, while also being so left in the dark and having your personality, hell, your very being molded based off the decisions and mistakes of a stranger really adds to the sympathetic feeling that the player may feel. And I could go on about how the princess represents the beginning and end of things. Where she is death, she's also her birth. How she comes together by experiencing the ends and perspectives of her many selves. Slaying her ends the concept of ruin, but also brings about entropy, as the Long Quiet is growth and expansion. But without a proper end in sight, there's no room for change. but also no room of loss for something great, and whether or not one may see that as a good thing is a conflict of its own. Part of me wants to just cover the game's main theme, where the game's notes seem to hit this perfect tightrope of tension of an introduction to a horror story with an utter sense of loneliness and longing. However, despite all of this, I think the most captivating subject in this game is the most simple one: trust.
So, I could tell you that I'd lead a quiet life in the woods, or that I'd open an orphanage, or that I'd do any other number of good things that I'm sure you think you want to hear. But you don't really know me, do you? What can my word possibly be worth in a situation like this?
She's right about one thing. Her word isn't worth anything.
Like I said, it's all about trust. Blind trust.
On the surface, it seems to be two outlets, whether or not Quiet can trust the princess or the narrator, an unreliable narrator in the most literal sense. After all, both of them are rather evasive when you inquire further one way or another, and you're deliberately isolated in this he said she said scenario. The narrator does everything in his power to prime you against the princess, and doesn't care whether or not you approach the scenario rationally, so long as you agree with him. He's also in an advantageous position where most vessels of the princess can't hear what he has to say when convincing you. She cannot address his arguments directly, but this limited information goes two ways, as vessels remember previous loops until they meet the true princess, while the narrator is incapable of remembering loops, something that she does use to her advantage at times. The way the princess presents herself can be seen as especially manipulative, intentionally or not, and there are plenty of times where it undeniably is. Whether or not the princess can even survive a stabbing you give her is completely dependent on if the player is confident that she's dead. But her dying words are her making a menacing remark just to sow doubt. Any hesitation after that is enough to put air in her lungs and to strike a fatal blow on you. This, as well as a few other moments, to me implies some level of awareness on the princess's end of what she's capable of. But inevitably, as the princess sees more ends, becomes more whole, and you would think more powerful than the long Quiet, she still needs Quiet to make the final decision and set her free. Even with the seemingly cosmic power of being made whole with perspective and understanding, Quiet is still the great decider. As for the narrator, his power is also very limited. He can force the door out the basement locked shut, make the blade appear, and even make Quiet try to stab the princess, but he alone doesn't have enough power to force you to go through with the process. In fact, sometimes these interjecting voices are more powerful than the narrator. Choices get grayed out when they lead to routes that the princess has already experienced in the story, but that's not his doing. The narrator doesn't even know of these iterations. Despite objections and attempts to impede anything against the goal of slaying the princess, the narrator ultimately needs Quiet to actually take action. This is why he primes him so much before the decision is made, though some of this is for Quiet's own good. After all, the narrator understands the nature of the princess, and how the two are intertwined, thus even explaining why the princess is dangerous would by design make her more dangerous, while not necessarily stealing Quiet's resolve to slay her or earn his trust. While giving an elusively limited amount of information, he has to give the strongest possible foot forward, because both of them can be rather persuasive.
The more I say, the more your mind will swim into dangerous waters. Even saying that is too much. Causality doesn't matter here, because the end result is the same no matter what led us up to this point. If the princess leaves the cabin, the world will end, and there is no changing that. It's no use arguing semantics over a metaphorical chicken or egg, because the egg is hatched and it's about to ruin everything.
But again, it's one word against another, and one's asking you to do a seemingly heinous act with no context. The reason I'm explaining all this is that Quiet and the narrator seem as much prisoners in this situation as the princess, the difference being the narrator intends to keep it that way. But the withholding of such information goes to show how each party involved weaponizes their secrets, and only further emphasizes the codependency here. The weak and flowing power the narrator actually has in the story becomes more blatant near the end when you're reaching the conclusion of the looping. The narrator falls apart and determines that too many iterations of himself have failed to get you to slay the princess and remain inside to prevent the world from ending. My favorite little detail here is that if you tell him that you're going to finally put a stop to this, he's unsure. Previously, the narrator knew when Quiet was lying. The narrator can't read the player's thoughts, but if you made the protagonist lie to him, he comments that he can tell when you're lying. Here, the narrator doesn't have that power, far too diluted in the dying breath that is the echo of a life that was lost before the game even began. If you reassure him in his final moments, whether or not you mean it, is something that he has to determine for himself. The only hope there is in that dying light is for him to trust you. Whether he does or not, and whether you do go through with it, won't change that. In May, the Princess Vessels, the story is the same. The Spectre needs your body, and by extension your permission, to escape the cabin. The trust is a two-way street here as well. Spectre tells quite truthfully she doesn't know the ins and outs of the possession process, how much it would hurt, if it would be reversible, or how much control Quiet would maintain. The only thing she knows for sure is that in this form, she needs your permission to do so. You have to give permission of the victim you murdered to hijack your body so that she can leave and feel the warmth of freedom. But that also works in the favor of the paranoia that there might be retributive justice on your end. I mean, just because you deserve it doesn't mean you'll humor her. But even when she's more hostile, even when she's more powerful like the Wraith who forcibly takes your body, or the Nightmare shattering his mind, ultimately, she still needs the player to have Quiet submit in some way to allow her to win. When she's superior and stronger to Quiet, the player still has agency to allow the princess to earn her freedom. In the times they oppose her, they have to admit defeat to move the plot forward. But these opportunities leave ways to outmaneuver said princesses, or to simply not engage. There are some vessels with no real interest in leaving and just want to hurt Quiet. For honest misunderstandings, I assure you. But in these scenarios, where the narrator can't do much to help, and the princess is so much stronger than you, it's here where the voices really shine. Their calls and advice are numerous, but there come occasions where you'll have to gamble on the advice of one. Though some give better advice than others,
She skewers you.
the voices created in the loop tend to have better intuition that keeps Quiet alive than the narrator. After all, he is merely an echo, describing what happens, while the voices are a response to the course of events. They are worth putting faith in when the situation becomes dire, but they're far from a sure-shot means of escaping a situation with your life. There's a bit of that element in many of the game's past, but personally, my favorite approach for these stories is when either Quiet or the princess have to become completely vulnerable in the power dynamic to escape. Hence why my favorite stories have been the likes of Spectre. Another pretty easy example is the Prisoner, one of the more clever vessels of the princess. She's the result of bringing the blade, but not attacking her, and when forced to, warning her and resisting the narrator's control. She kills you. Seemingly in callous fashion as well. The next life, she feigns ignorance of the past one you both experienced, realizing quickly that an outside force is eavesdropping and preventing them from leaving after the experiences of previous events. Something tied to Quiet, so whatever information she can leverage, she has to hold close. There are a couple ways that she can be freed, but the more direct one requires for you to give her the pristine blade. The weapon is a contentious point when it's brought up. Although you have a lot of leverage against the princess if she intends to escape, this blade gives you more tangible negotiation power. If you give it to her, she proceeds to saw her own head off, before lying slumped over in the process. Now it's up to Quiet whether or not to take the blade back and maybe her head. You know, as a trophy. If you take the head out of the cabin with you, the narrator doesn't object. It's weird, but she's dead. He got what he wanted. Except this actually frees her. The prisoner was merely playing dead. From my understanding, the pristine blade has to pierce the heart to actually slay the princess. The princess had omit this information from you, and by extension, the narrator, for this to work. A vessel as cold and calculating as the prisoner had to take a complete leap of faith that left her without a body, and the ability to speak further lest jeopardize the ruse. All of that, and it was put in the faith of Quiet's intuition, and assuming his intent to help her because of previous events. The player had to put faith in the princess that she had a plan that required her to be the one with the weapon, and that risk and sacrifice is paid in kind. The entire plan was clever, but required so much to wordlessly go right that this entire course of action was a Hail Mary in of itself. Which takes me to my last example, which would be the Thorn, who from my understanding is a fan favorite and, well, I can't contrarian hipster my way out of this one, she's my favorite as well. It helps that she's a third stage vessel, which means there's a lot of build up to her. To get the Thorn, you have to meet the friendly princess. You have to stab her on the back when she starts gnawing off her arm, then commit. You both die fighting each other, and this will bring you to the witch. The witch is a pretty straightforward vessel. She doesn't trust you in the slightest. Why would she? She lowered her guard around you and you attacked her while she was vulnerable. But this leads to her being incredibly deceptive herself, which again is to be expected. But because she's so certain that you'll betray her, she desires to act first every time, regardless of your intent. This makes for a tragic outcome where it's impossible to free the witch. One of you will always betray the other. Though betray might not be the right word, it implies that there was some form of trust between you to begin with. And that very caution becomes self-sufficient and ironically self-destructive. But there's a way out of the cycle, and that's to arrive with the blade, and when she thinks all pretenses of peace were dropped, give it to her. The power dynamic is now shifted, leaving Quiet disarmed and the only way for her to escape. But that leverage alone won't garner trust. Surrendering his only form of self-defense while tensions are at their highest does sow a bit of doubt, but not quite enough it seems, as she tries to convince herself that it's a trick, and kills Quiet with the very same blade. And when she's standing over your body, in the realization that nothing had occurred, and that there was no grand scheme, what ultimately came of it other than Quiet's demise?
I did it! I got you! You... Why? Why did you let me do this?
The third time you return, there is no pristine blade on the table. Only when you go down to the basement do you find out why, as it's the princess that's firmly grasping it this time. This is the Thorn, the result of Quiet's betrayal, and the doubt that she had developed in his dying breath after snapping the olive branch. She asked if this was your doing, and if you knew that this would happen. Even now, she's trying to discern an ulterior motive with Quiet, and it's not necessarily wrong. Both the player and Quiet during the Witches chapter know that they can come back from death, and there seems to be a soft reset on death. It's not impossible for Quiet to have intuited that his actions had made the princess more dangerous, and that a more peaceful approach might diffuse that a little more in the next life. The player likely knows all of this to be the case, especially if this is not the first vessel that they've acquired. And if the princess is perceived with hesitation or doubt at the end of the life, it would theoretically make her a lot more vulnerable for slaying. Of course, the princess doesn't know about the player's involvement in this, but she knows that Quiet retains memories, as the act of solidarity of handing over the blade was a clear sign of that regret. In her isolated lifestyle, she has ample reason to believe Quiet knows more about this than she does. She may seem apologetic, but not quite. She's more confused, if anything. The name and visuals clearly representing the volatile nature on her current mood of things, and has to be approached with care to avoid further harm. Her appearance is a mesh between the witch and the princess, more showing that internal conflict. Her voice is more melancholic, conflicted, but if you reach for the blade before she allows you, her voice quickly snaps back to the witch.
I knew this was the only reason you'd come back down here. I'm not falling for it. It's mine now, and I'll let these thorns tear me to shreds before I hand it over.
There's very obviously still tension. She still has the blade, and thus the tool you need to slay her. But also, the implement needed to set her free.
I want to trust you.
Her grip tightens on the blade.
But you're hiding something, aren't you? Why would you help me if you weren't helping yourself?
If you manage to talk to her enough to convince her to give you the blade, she is at your complete mercy. And even in the process of freeing her, she still suspects that you would do something. I think my favorite detail about the Thorn is when you two exit together, it is nearly cut for cut identical to a different scene in the game. The damsel. The damsel is what happens when you arrive without the blade, trust the princess wholeheartedly, and give your life to save her at the end of your first. The damsel is a doting figure that only wants to make Quiet happy, and because of this is very shallow. She unravels if you so much as try to make her show any sense of agency, as if the world is wondering why you care about this type of stuff now. The Thorn, however, carries that identical scene built off of strife, betrayals, and faults of both parties. It presents itself with more depth and history between the two, which by extension makes it more meaningful to overcome. I know that the writer is very much primate with the narrator talking about how trite this is, and the voice of the smitten being really, really annoying, while even the hero is thinking it's a bit much, but I do completely understand why and agree with their assessment. The parts of the story like this are why I really enjoy the game and think it's something special. As much as it likes to explore self-worth, the value of fear and death, the perspectives of perpetuity, as much as it enjoys unraveling the secrets of the world Quiet's trapped in, along with a princess in these different paths. It's things so simple as when to keep a secret, tracking what they know and don't in dialogue, and when to put fate in someone else's hands, that show that this game isn't just trying to sound complex. It's built a foundation that allows itself to be. But that's all I have for now, and if you enjoyed this assessment, I would appreciate if you gave the game a look. I hope you all have a good day and be safe.